The Wolfenstein series has sure been around the block a fair few times. The FPS entries in the franchise started with Wolfenstein 3D way back in 1992, and shortly after that the prequel named Spirit of Destiny. It then hibernated for about 9 years before unleashing Return to Castle Wolfenstein on the world in 2001, arguably a game that's one of the best of the old school shooters, before it took another 8-year hiatus until Wolfenstein in 2009. The recent entries in the series, The New Order, The Old Blood and The New Colossus, divided fans a fair bit, but most people I think would agree that the series definitely has had a pretty good run so far. It's no surprise then that it's still an influence to this current day, and I think no better example of that is a Doom mod called Blade of Agony. A mod that seems to take a lot of elements from Wolfenstein 3D and Return to Castle Wolfenstein. Though to be honest, calling it a mod is a little bit insulting because at this point it's really its own game entirely. It just happens to be running on the Doom engine. Playing as good old BJ Blazkowicz, you're back in the saddle in occupied Europe, taking on the Nazi war machine across 2 chapters, with 17 levels all up. With the 3rd chapter planned to be released, With the 3rd chapter planned to be released, God knows when. Blade of Agony takes all the best elements from FPS games from the mid-90s and early 2000s and often turns you into its bitch in the best way possible. Now, despite taking a lot of its influence from Wolfenstein, obviously with the protagonists and the majority of the sprite work, Blade of Agony also feels a lot like the old Call of Duty and Medal of Honor games, with objectives like rescuing a POW, destroying AA guns and planting C4 to blow up some kind of facility. And there's even a mission later in the 2nd chapter where you're disguised in a scientist's clothes, evading the Gestapo as you sneak around a U-boat base. Even the designs of some of the missions with this large open flow and multiple objectives reminds me a lot of playing Medal of Honor on the PlayStation or Allied Assault back on the PC. And it even uses some of the music from the original Medal of Honor games too. When the paranormal and occult elements are introduced later in the game, like the Spirit of Destiny in the 1st chapter, it does start to feel a lot more like Wolfenstein. And the beginning of the 2nd chapter where you're busting out of a prison cell feels almost like a direct homage to Wolfenstein 3D. Now, a shooting game is only as good as its weapon lineup, and Blade of Agony treads some familiar but welcome ground. You can expect to see weapons like a Luger pistol, an MP40 and a Kar 98K, though sadly there's no MP44 or a Browning automatic rifle, which is a bit of a bummer. Maybe that's something for Chapter 3. And as was pretty commonplace for 90s FPS games, you've got the more novelty weapons, like a fast-firing rocket launcher, a chain gun that's a homage to the same weapon in Wolfenstein 3D, and a flamethrower because, I mean, who doesn't like roasting Nazis? Gotta say too, this really is a pretty damn good looking mod. I mean, it's staggering to think this is running on the Doom engine, albeit heavily modified, because it just looks incredible at times. Now, it might look a bit basic if you've never played Doom and have no point of reference, but the stuff that's been worked into this mod is just incredibly impressive. From the pixel art, which is often highly detailed, but also the incidental effects like the lighting and some of the weather effects. There's also a pretty good variety between missions too, like in one you might be moving through a bunch of weird laboratories, then the next you're on the beaches of Normandy fighting in the trenches and avoiding MG nests. A couple of missions later you're in Paris working with the French resistance, fighting on the street in between moving through creepy catacombs. Chapter 2 mixes things up even more. The first mission's almost entirely stealth-based as you escape a prison, staying to the shadows to remain undetected and stabbing people in the back with a combat knife. It's almost this constant shift in where you are and what you're doing that means the mod never feels like it's getting boring or monotonous. The HQ you move around in between missions has all these random NPCs walking around, and in between getting briefings and talking to characters you can even head to a nearby bar. And it makes the environments feel a lot more populated and less like empty rooms. Blade of Agony seems to mostly use sprites that are either taken from or influenced by Return to Castle Wolfenstein and obviously Wolfenstein 3D. But I also saw sprites and textures taken from Duke Nukem 3D, Rise of the Triad, Exhumed, Blood, Serious Sam and Hexen just off the top of my head. At 1.2 there's an area that's a direct homage to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. That same mission even has a minecart ride and booby traps you have to avoid. I mean, it's just great. It really captures that feeling, mostly from Return to Castle Wolfenstein, where you feel like a Special Forces soldier one minute, then a treasure hunter the next. Wouldn't be a Wolfenstein game if you couldn't steal all the Nazi gold you can carry, and in Blade of Agony you'll be coming across this stuff all the time, some out in the open and some hidden away. In between missions, you can spend this gold on a quartermaster at the HQ for armor, medkits, and more important things like health upgrades or a mine detector. Now, I never really bought any armor or medkits because I found those were in abundance during missions, but the health upgrades I found really handy. And you'll want to buy as much shit as you can possibly afford because the missions in this game are both long and challenging. And there's some missions that I think took me upwards of an hour to get through. Some of the map design in this game is just really complex. I'd almost say it's too complex at times. Like, it feels like they've just made the levels as big as they possibly can for the sake of it. You've always got a bunch of key objectives and then secondary objectives which are optional. But it's easy to get sidetracked exploring and kinda lose your train of thought, forgetting what the hell you were doing. Sometimes too, you can even get new objectives mid-mission, making it even more confusing. It's old school, but it's like the most hardcore kind of old school. Like, it reminds me of games like Hexen and Strife. What I think's neat too is how they've color-coded doors. So for starters, if a door is brown, it's one you can interact with and open, but if it's grey, it's inaccessible. It's a good way of allowing the level design to still be detailed and have lots of doorways to make the environment look like a real place. And it prevents you from having to walk up to every single door to see if you can open it. The other thing is that doors that require a certain key or a keycard will often have the corresponding colour on the door itself. Again, it's just a simple way of explaining something to the player in an instant with a basic visual aid. It's not entirely perfect though, and at times the levels can feel a bit switch and key heavy. And by that I mean you're always just looking for the next switch to flip or key to find to get to the next area. It can be pretty confusing at times. Thank God for the compass and the automap. Now, before I even played this mod, all people were telling me is how goddamn hard it is. And whilst the mod does have a couple of areas that I think are total horseshit, I felt overall the difficulty felt pretty balanced. At least playing on the default difficulty mode that the game recommended. The thing is that you take damage really quickly in this game, especially from enemies with automatic weapons, and you can go from full health and armor to a critical state really easily, especially if someone happens to shoot you from behind or even if they just get off a couple of lucky shots. Enemies later in the game become absolute bullet sponges and they're just going to soak up an entire magazine from your Sten or MP40, or you know, survive 2 or 3 grenades to the face like it's nothing. But look, you can easily mitigate how much damage you take by just not storming through levels like it's a run and gun shooter. Instead, you can try popping in and out of cover to take shots at enemies. I mean, it might run on the Doom engine, but if you play it like Doom, you're gonna have a bad time. You occasionally encounter these boss type enemies, which are basically just thick boys or girls with health bars that can take a lot more damage. But I actually found these guys easier than the standard enemies. Their hitboxes are so huge and they move so slowly, they're just like these slow lumbering targets just begging to be put out of their misery. Not to mention almost all of them use projectile weapons. I mean, it's weird because they really should be the toughest enemies in the game, but I thought they ended up being the easiest. Like I said though, there are the odd occasions that are really unfair, and if you don't have enough health or ammo at these points, you're often pretty much screwed. And I think they might have even made those mutant enemies from Wolfenstein 3D overpowered and cheap on purpose to kind of mirror how tough they were in the original game. Yeah, remember those assholes? They're back and just as annoying. The cheapest areas are these kind of first-time player traps where a bunch of enemies suddenly come out of a nearby room once you've picked up some kind of important item. And look, you're not going to expect this to happen for a first-time playthrough and probably be unprepared and subsequently killed. Just kind of a lame way of making the game more challenging, which is something the mod really doesn't need to do because when it's being fair, it's still challenging anyway. One of the more annoying things is when you've got a mission with an AI teammate that just follows you around like they're surgically attached. Kind of reminds me a lot of the NPCs in Half-Life 2, but at least you could tell those guys to hang back. Here your allies just follow you incessantly, and it pisses me off. It pisses me off. The stuff I really don't like though is when you have to shoot spiders, rats, or bats. Vermin-type enemies are just the most annoying pricks in every single game they appear in, and it's no different in Blade of Agony. At least they only appear in environments where it makes sense for them to be, but still, I mean, just fuck these things right off. And why do they only attack the player and not the enemies? What are they, like, trained by the Nazis or something? Anyway, the only other complaint I really have is that there's just not enough of the paranormal element. Blade of Agony to me is a Wolfenstein mod or a game over anything else, and it's very much old school Wolfenstein as opposed to new school. So you're not going to have to worry about a pregnant woman backflipping over a robot dog, firing dual machine guns and throwing grenades, thank God. The ending of Spear of Destiny kind of kicked this off, I think, where you're pretty much teleported to hell and confronting the Angel of Death. In Return to Castle Wolfenstein, you're taking on shield and axe-wielding zombies and eventually killing a resurrected warlord. Even the whole central theme of the 2009 game was about this alternate dimension accessed through something called the Veil that the player could move in and out of. Blade of Agony does have a few paranormal moments, but they're few and far between, and just when they start to get good, they often end, as most of them come at the conclusion of each chapter. These sequences for me were the highlights of the whole thing, and I just hope there's going to be more of them in the final update. Chapter 2 actually ends on a pretty nail-biting cliffhanger with a twist that you can kind of see coming, but still it sets up things pretty well for the finale. All up, Chapter 1 took me around 4 hours to finish, and Chapter 2 took me closer to 6, so even in its current state there's a lot of gameplay to be had. If you want to look at this thing as a Doom mod, it excels. If you want to look at it as a Wolfenstein game, it also excels. Look, the key takeaway here is that it excels, and that's all you really need to know. So check out the mod, support the devs and all that shit, and let's get psyched for Chapter 3. Bring 'em on.